Emotional labor is one of the most misunderstood aspects of escort work. Most people think the work is physical, or sexual, or psychological in an abstract way. But the core of the work is emotional regulation in intimate contexts. Tracking mood, adjusting presence, managing closeness, staying attuned. And regulation is labor. As the creator of the Psychology for Escort framework and founder of Psychologists for Escorts, I help exceptional women understand the psychological impact of their work. This episode is about that labor, not the visible part, but the part that accumulates quietly, the part that doesn't look heavy, but changes the nervous system over time. Every client interaction begins before it begins, before you knock on the door, before your eyes meet, before you speak the first word. The regulation has already started. In the previous episode, we talked about the psychological frame that makes that possible: fantasy. Emotional labor is what sustains it once the encounter starts. It's what carries the fantasy into daily reality. Emotional labor isn't unique to escort work. Nurses do it, therapists do it, caregivers do it. Any profession that involves emotional attunement requires it. But escort work asks for something those professions don't. It asks for emotional availability inside physical intimacy, inside proximity, inside touch, inside desire. And the nervous system doesn't process those inputs as neutral. It doesn't matter that it's professional. The body doesn't read contracts. So, when emotional regulation happens inside intimacy, repeatedly, without reciprocity, the nervous system adapts in ways it doesn't adapt to a conversation across a desk. There is no mutual exchange. One person receives attunement, the other person provides it. One person brings the needs, the other person regulates around those needs. And that asymmetry matters. Because intimacy is not just connection, it's also regulation. When intimacy flows both ways, the nervous system restores itself. When care is mutual, presence is mutual, attunement is mutual, the system recovers. Reciprocity is what allows intimacy to restore rather than drain. But when intimacy flows in one direction, the nervous system shifts into management mode. It begins to conserve. It begins to regulate more tightly. It begins to protect capacity. And this is not emotional. It's biological. When emotional labor becomes repetitive without reciprocity, the nervous system adapts to protect itself. And that adaptation happens through regulation. Emotional labor is not pretending, and it's not lying. It's the active regulation of your inner state to meet the emotional needs of someone else. Regulation means adjusting what you feel, not expressing everything, not reacting naturally, but shaping your emotional presence, moment by moment. And that shaping happens continuously, often without words, but through constant inner scanning. What does he need right now? What mood should I match? How warm should I be? How distant should I stay? What level of attention keeps things smooth? This is not something you do once. It's something you maintain, minute after minute, date after date. And while doing that, you stay pleasant, available, contained. You hold space. You manage energy. You prevent friction. This is not fake. This is skilled emotional work. It requires perception, timing, self-control, and emotional intelligence. Emotional labor does not require emotional attachment. You don't have to care. You don't have to feel connected. But it does require emotional presence. You have to be tuned in. You have to notice shifts. You have to respond appropriately. And presence costs energy. Attention costs energy. Regulation costs energy. And when this happens occasionally, the system recovers. But when it happens repeatedly, without reciprocity, the nervous system begins to conserve. It tightens. It narrows range. It optimizes efficiency. And that optimization is what slowly changes experience. This is why emotional labor accumulates. Not because any single moment is too much, but because regulation becomes constant. And constant regulation reshapes how the nervous system operates. This is important to understand. Emotional labor works because it creates safety. It creates ease. It creates the experience the client is paying for. When someone feels seen, understood, emotionally held, their nervous system relaxes. And relaxation is what allows intimacy to feel good. This isn't accidental, it's biology. And many women are good at this, long before they ever enter this work. Not because they trained for it, but because they learned it. They learned how to read rooms, how to sense tension, how to adjust tone, how to soften situations, how to keep things smooth. For many women, these skills developed early in life, in families where mood shifted, where conflict had to be managed, where staying attuned kept things safer. This is not unusual. For many women, emotional attunement was not a professional choice. It was a survival skill that preceded the work by years. This work doesn't invent disability, it recognizes it. And then it monetizes it by turning an internal regulation skill into a repeatable service. This is why emotional labor can feel natural, effortless, like something you have always done. And when something feels natural, it rarely feels like labor. But here's the key insight. What feels natural is often something you learned to survive. When survival skills become professional skills, they don't stop costing energy. They simply become normalized. And normalized effort is easy to overlook. This is why many women don't notice the load at first. It doesn't feel heavy. It feels familiar. It feels like competence. It feels like being good at what you do. And when survival skills become labor, they become expensive. Not emotionally dramatic, but biologically costly. And this is rarely something women consciously choose at entry. Because it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like who you are. And when something feels like who you are, you rarely experience it as an effort. You experience it as normal. And what becomes normal often becomes invisible. And that's where the cost begins. The cost of emotional labor rarely shows up immediately. It doesn't arrive as crisis. It shows up gradually, as emotional fatigue. A tiredness that doesn't disappear after rest, as reduced curiosity, less interest in people, less desire in engaging deeply, less emotional spark. As a narrowing of range, highs feel softer, low feel flatter. Everything sits closer to neutral, not just doing the work, but outside of it. Because the nervous system doesn't have an on-off switch. It doesn't separate professional regulation from personal life. It learns patterns. And once a pattern is learned, it becomes the default. What you regulate repeatedly, you eventually regulate automatically. Automatic regulation means you don't choose it anymore. It happens before awareness, before emotion rises fully, before reaction is complete. And automatic regulation feels like distance. Not coldness, not dysfunction, just less intensity. This is where many women say, I feel fine, but something is quieter than it used to be. Not unhappy, not numb, just muted. Joy feels softer, connection feels thinner, excitement fades faster. And because this happens slowly, it often goes unquestioned. It feels like maturity, it feels like calm, it feels like being composed, when in reality, it's long-term regulation becoming baseline. This is why emotional labor is so easy to underestimate. Because the cost doesn't scream, it whispers. And whispers are easy to live with. Until they aren't. And when change happens quietly, it's easy to assume it's personal, that something about this is wrong. But what's actually happening is structural. The nervous system doesn't fail. It adapts. Earlier in this series, we talked about psychological contracts, about the inner agreements that make work possible. Emotional labor is one of the costs those contracts quietly include. When you enter work that requires constant regulation, your system doesn't just agree to tasks. It agrees to patterns. Patterns of attention, patterns of emotional management, patterns of presence. And those patterns always carry a load. And this is where I want to be very clear. This is not about weakness, and it's not about poor boundaries. It's about asymmetry. One person receives emotional attunement, the other provides it. One person is supported emotionally, the other holds that support. And asymmetry always requires compensation. In escort work, that compensation is money. Money makes the exchange possible. It makes the arrangement acceptable. But money doesn't restore nervous system capacity. It does not refill emotional energy. It does not undo regulation. It only compensates the exchange. It doesn't neutralize the impact. Money compensates the exchange. It doesn't naturalize the impact. This is why money becomes central, not because it heals what the work costs, but because it justifies continuing. It makes the imbalance feel fair. It gives meaning to the effort. And when people forget this, they start moralizing a physiological process. They say things like, "She's just cold now. She has bad boundaries. She's emotionally distant." When, in reality, they are describing adaptation. They interpret regulation as personality and nervous system efficiency as character. This misunderstanding is what creates shame, not the process itself. And at some point, many women notice a shift. Not a breakdown, not a crisis, just a change in how things feel. They are still functioning, still professional, still composed. Everything looks the same from the outside. But inside, feeling becomes muted. Emotions rise less intensely. Reactions soften faster. Connection feels thinner. This is not burnout, and it's not pathology. It's adaptation optimized for continuation. The nervous system is choosing efficiency. It's efficiency, clean biological efficiency. Numbing is often the nervous system becoming economical. Economical means using less energy, less emotional activation, less intensity. And economy is not a failure, it's a strategy. But it's a trade-off. You trade depth for stability. You trade intensity for control. You trade openness for sustainability. And trade-off matters when you want intimacy that isn't regulated. Intimacy that doesn't require managing yourself, monitoring your tone, adjusting your reactions, staying composed. Because once regulation becomes automatic, it doesn't turn off when the context changes. It becomes your default state. And that's when women often say, "I don't feel broken, but I don't feel fully alive either." And again, this is not something you caused. It's something your system learned. And what is learned can be understood. And what is understood can be held with awareness. Emotional labor is not a flaw in this work. It's one of its core demands. Just like physical stamina is a demand of physical labor, emotional regulation is a demand in intimate labor. And demands always require awareness. Not because something is wrong, but because repeated effort always shapes capacity. When you give emotional presence repeatedly, without receiving it in return, your nervous system adjusts. It learns how much to offer, how intensely to feel, how open to remain. And over time, that adjustment changes how receiving feels. Not dramatically, quietly. This is why awareness matters. Not to stop working, not to judge the work, but to understand its impact. Because what you repeatedly give without receiving will eventually change how you feel capable of receiving. Intimacy without reciprocity is sustainable, but never neutral. If something in this episode felt familiar, not as information, but as recognition, that recognition is worth paying attention to.